confinement and of winter. His son, he said, would come, and the rest they might settle themselves. Away they hurried hither and thither, altered men, and dragged the chief mutineers in chains to Caius Caetronius, commander of the first legion, who tried and punished them one by one in the following fashion. In front of the throng stood the legions with drawn swords. Each accused man was on a raised platform, and was pointed out by a tribune. If they shouted out that he was guilty, he was thrown headlong and cut to pieces. The soldiers gloated over the bloodshed, as though it gave them absolution. Nor did Caesar check them, seeing that without any order from himself the same men were responsible for all the cruelty and all the odium of the deed. The example was followed by the veterans, who were soon afterwards sent into Rhaetia, nominally to defend the province against a threatened invasion of the Suevi, but really that they might tear themselves from a camp stamped with the horror of a dreadful remedy no less than with the memory of guilt. Then the general revised the list of centurions. Each at his summons stated his name, his rank, his birthplace, the number of his campaigns, what brave deeds he had done in battle, his military rewards, if any. If the tribunes and the legion commended his energy and good behaviour, he retained his rank. Where they unanimously charged him with rapacity or cruelty, he was dismissed the service. Quiet being thus restored for the present, a no less formidable difficulty remained with the turbulence of the 5th and 21st legions, who were in winter quarters 60 miles away at Old Camp, as the place was called. These, in fact, had been the first to begin the mutiny, and the most atrocious deeds had been committed at their hands. Unawed by the punishment of their comrades, and unmoved by their contrition, they still retained their resentment. Caesar accordingly proposed to send an armed fleet with some of our allies down the Rhine, resolved to make war on them should they reject his authority. At Rome, meanwhile, when the result of affairs in Illyrium was not yet known, and men had heard of the commotion among the German legions, the citizens in alarm reproached Tiberius for the hypocritical irresolution with which he was befooling the Senate and the people, feeble and disarmed as they were, while the soldiery were all the time in revolt, and could not be quelled by the yet imperfectly matured authority of 2 striplings. He ought to have gone himself and confronted with his imperial majesty those who would have soon yielded, when they once saw a sovereign of long experience, who was the supreme dispenser of rigor or of bounty. Could Augustus, with the feebleness of age on him, so often visit Germany? And is Tiberius in the vigor of life to sit in the Senate and criticize its members' words? He had taken good care that there should be slavery at Rome. He should now apply some soothing medicine to the spirit of the soldiers, that they might be willing to endure peace. Notwithstanding these remonstrances, it was the inflexible purpose of Tiberius not to quit the headquarters of empire, or to imperil himself and the state. Indeed, many conflicting thoughts troubled him. The army in Germany was the stronger, that in Pannonia the nearer. The first was supported by all the strength of Gaul, the latter menaced Italy. Which was he to prefer, without the fear that those whom he slighted would be infuriated by the affront? But his sons might alike visit both, and not compromise the imperial dignity, which inspired the greatest awe at a distance. There was also an excuse for mere youths, referring some matters to their father, with the possibility that he could conciliate or crush those who resisted Germanicus or Drusus. What resource remained, if they despised the emperor? However, as if on the eve of departure, he selected his attendants, provided his camp equipage, and prepared a fleet. Then winter and matters of business were the various pretexts with which he amused, first sensible men, then the populace, last and longest of all, the provinces. Germanicus, meantime, though he had concentrated his army and prepared vengeance against the mutineers, thought that he ought still to allow them an interval, in case they might, with the late warning before them, regard their safety. He sent a dispatch to Caecina, saying that he was on the way with a strong force, and that, unless they forestalled his arrival by the execution of the guilty, he would resort to an indiscriminate massacre. Caecina read the letter confidentially to the eagle and standard bearers, and to all in the camp who were least tainted by disloyalty, and urged them to save the whole army from disgrace, and themselves from destruction. In peace, he said, the merits of a man's cause are carefully weighed. When war bursts on us, innocent and guilty alike perish. Upon this they sounded those whom they thought best for their purpose, and when they saw that a majority of their legions remained loyal, at the commander's suggestion they fixed a time for falling with the sword on the vilest and foremost of the mutineers. Then, at a mutually given signal, they rushed into the tents, and butchered the unsuspecting men, none but those in the secret knowing what was the beginning or what may be the end of the slaughter. The scene was a contrast to all civil wars which have ever occurred. It was not in battle, it was not from opposing camps, it was from those same dwellings where day saw them at their common meals, night resting from labor, that they divided themselves into two factions, and showered on each other their missiles. Uproar, wounds, bloodshed were everywhere visible. The cause was a mystery. All else was at the disposal of chance. Even some loyal men were slain, for, on its being once understood who were the objects of fury, some of the worst mutineers too had seized on weapons. Neither commander nor tribune was present to control them. The men were allowed license and vengeance to their hearts' content. Soon afterwards Germanicus entered the camp, exclaiming with a flood of tears that this was destruction rather than remedy, ordered the bodies to be burnt. Even then their savage spirit was seized with desire to march against the enemy, as an atonement for their frenzy, and it was felt that the shades of their fellow soldiers could be appeased only by exposing such impious breasts to honorable scars. Caesar followed up the enthusiasm of the men, and having bridged over the Rhine, he sent across it 12,000 from the legions, with 26 allied cohorts, and 8 squadrons of cavalry, whose discipline had been without a stain during the mutiny. There was exultation among the Germans, not far off, as long as we were detained by the public mourning for the loss of Augustus, and then by our dissensions. But the Roman general, in a forced march, cut through the Caesian forest and the barrier which had been begun by Tiberius, and pitched his camp on this barrier, his front and rear being defended by entrenchments, his flanks by timber barricades. He then penetrated some forest passes but little known, and, as there were 2 routes, he deliberated whether he should pursue the short and ordinary route, or that which was more difficult unexplored, and consequently unguarded by the enemy. He chose the longer way, and hurried on every remaining preparation, for his scouts had brought word that among the Germans it was a night of festivity, with games, and one of their grand banquets. Caecina had orders to advance with some light cohorts, and to clear away any obstructions from the woods. The legions followed at a moderate interval. They were helped by a night of bright starlight, reached the villages of the Marsi, and threw their pickets round the enemy, who even then were stretched on beds or at their tables, without the least fear or any sentries before their camp. So complete was their carelessness and disorder, and of war indeed there was no apprehension. Peace it certainly was not, merely the languid and heedless ease of half-intoxicated people. Caesar, to spread devastation widely, divided his eager legions into 4 columns, and ravaged a space of 50 miles with fire and sword. Neither sex nor age moved his compassion. Everything, sacred or profane, the temple too of Typhana, as they called it, the special resort of all those tribes, was leveled to the ground. There was not a wound among our soldiers who cut down a half asleep or unarmed or a straggling foe. The Bructeri, Tubantes, and Usipetes were roused by this slaughter, and they beset the forest passes through which our army had to return. The general knew this, and he marched, prepared both to advance and to fight. Part of the cavalry and some of the auxiliary cohorts led the van. Then came the 1st Legion, and with the baggage in the center, the men of the 21st closed up the left, those of the 5th the right flank. The 20th Legion secured the rear, and next were the rest of the allies. Meanwhile the enemy moved not till the army began to defile in column through the woods, then made some slight skirmishing attacks on its flanks and van, and with his whole force charged the rear. The light cohorts were thrown into confusion by the dense masses of the Germans, when Caesar